Donald Trump, with his decades of media dominance and sharp political instincts, believed that no congressional representative could ever pose a true threat to him, especially someone he considered a mere newcomer to the political scene. His entire career had been built on the premise that he could control the narrative, manipulate public opinion, and outmaneuver any opponent with his charismatic presence and mastery of media. He had weathered scandals, impeachment trials, and countless media battles, all without ever truly being held accountable for his actions. So, when he agreed to appear on CNN's State of the Union with rising Democratic star Jasmine Crockett, it was more a matter of convenience than challenge. Trump thought that the format of the interview, coupled with his larger-than-life persona, would allow him to dominate the conversation as he always did. It was a routine he was familiar with, where he could speak over his opponents, dismiss their questions with bravado, and manipulate the media's coverage to his advantage. This time, however, was different. As the cameras began to roll and the interview kicked off, the power dynamics were set to shift in ways Trump could not have anticipated. Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman from Texas, had meticulously prepared for this moment, and her approach was methodical, calculated, and far more effective than Trump's seasoned media performance could ever be. For Trump, the appearance on CNN was a chance to reclaim some form of relevance in the political conversation after his controversial presidency. His advisors had convinced him that appearing alongside a woman like Crockett, who had gained traction in the Democratic Party, would allow him to project an image of bipartisanship and statesmanship. It was an opportunity to repair his fractured relationship with suburban voters, particularly college-educated women who had turned against him during his time in office. This was his chance to look presidential, to engage in serious policy discussions, and to show that he could still hold sway in the world of politics. His advisors were confident that this would be a winning strategy. They believed that if Trump could come across as dignified and thoughtful, instead of just a loudmouth politician, it would help him regain his footing in the national conversation and reassert his influence. What Trump didn't count on was the fierce resolve of Jasmine Crockett. She had accepted the invitation to appear on CNN not as an attempt to increase her own media profile, but because she understood the gravity of the moment. She knew that this interview wasn't just about gaining television ratings or making political points. It was about holding someone accountable who had, in her eyes, betrayed the highest office in the land. This wasn't about policy or performance. It was about confronting a former president who had tested the very foundation of American democracy and gotten away with it. For Jasmine, this interview was an opportunity to strip away the myths and bluster surrounding Trump and force him to confront the consequences of his actions. She approached the interview with a steely determination and an unshakable sense of purpose. She wasn't looking to make headlines or sound bites. She was here to expose the truth, to reveal the contradictions and lies that had plagued Trump's time in office. In the weeks leading up to the interview, Jasmine turned her apartment in Dallas into a war room. She worked tirelessly, sometimes for 18 hours a day, reviewing documents, consulting constitutional scholars, and conducting interviews with former White House staffers. Her preparation was meticulous, going far beyond the typical political strategy sessions that Trump's team had engaged in. While Trump's advisors were focused on crafting talking points, deflecting uncomfortable questions, and rehearsing attack lines against the current administration, Jasmine's focus was different. She didn't rely on media consultants or spin doctors. Instead, she spent countless hours combing through archives, reviewing testimony, and creating a detailed timeline that connected every action to its consequence. The walls of her small apartment were covered in charts, maps, and documents that laid out the case against Trump in a way that was both systematic and irrefutable. Her preparation was her armor, and she knew that if she was going to take down a man who had spent his entire career manipulating the system, she would need to outwork him at every turn. Her preparation also extended to her mindset. Jasmine knew that the most crucial part of the interview would be her ability to stay composed under pressure. As a former public defender, she had learned that the best way to deal with hostile opponents was not to become defensive or emotional, but to stay calm and methodical. This approach was critical when dealing with a figure like Trump, who was known for his aggressive rhetoric and his ability to dominate conversations with sheer force of personality. Jasmine's strategy was simple. She would let him do all the talking while she quietly bided her time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Her questions would not be flashy or theatrical. They would be carefully crafted, grounded in undeniable facts, and delivered with unwavering precision. She had no interest in matching Trump's bombastic style or engaging in a battle of words. Instead, she planned to expose his contradictions and falsehoods with the quiet power of preparation and truth. In stark contrast, Trump's team was bracing for the usual media circus. They believed that with their preparation, they could navigate through any challenges that might arise during the interview. They focused on reinforcing Trump's message, bolstering his accomplishments, and making sure he stayed on script. They knew that he would dominate the conversation, as he had done so many times before by using his force of will to steer the interview in his favor. His advisors were skilled at managing his public image, and they believed that by deflecting difficult questions and redirecting the conversation to topics of his choosing, they could maintain control. For them, this was just another media appearance, another chance to push Trump's narrative to the forefront of American politics. But what Trump and his team didn't realize was that they were about to face a different kind of challenge. Jasmine. Crockett wasn't interested in the theatrics of political performance. She had no desire to engage in a shouting match or to play by the usual rules of political media. She came prepared, armed with a vast amount of information and a strategy that was designed to force Trump to confront his own record. From the very beginning of the interview, it became clear that the power dynamics were shifting. Jasmine was not just an opponent in the traditional sense. She was a force of nature, unyielding in her commitment to uncovering the truth. The stage was set for what was expected to be a historic moment in American political media. The CNN studio, carefully designed for the occasion, felt like an arena where two vastly different worlds would collide. Trump's world, one of power, wealth, and media mastery, was about to be confronted by the unyielding force of Jasmine's preparation and determination. As the cameras rolled, it became evident that the atmosphere in the room was tense, charged with an energy that only moments of true consequence can create. Both sides had arrived with different expectations, but it would soon become clear that the battle wasn't going to be fought on the familiar ground of sound bites and political theater. This was about something far deeper. It was about accountability. Trump's team, a well-oiled machine of political strategists, communication specialists, and legal advisors, had been preparing for weeks. They knew that this interview was going to be intense. After all, they were facing a congresswoman who had only recently gained prominence, someone who they assumed would be easily outmaneuvered with the same tricks and tactics that had served Trump so well throughout his career. His advisors believed that they could manage the conversation, deflect any uncomfortable questions, and ensure that the focus remained on Trump's policies and achievements rather than the controversies that surrounded his presidency. They had mapped out potential talking points, prepared for a range of deflections, and rehearsed responses to the kinds of questions they expected Jasmine to ask. In their eyes, this was just another appearance in a long line of interviews Trump had done over the years. The goal was clear: maintain control of the narrative, stay on message, and keep the focus on his supposed accomplishments. But Jasmine Crockett had a different approach. For her, this was not a performance. There were no rehearsed sound bites, no scripted responses. She had done the hard work, the long hours, and the meticulous research to ensure that her questions would be sharp, precise, and grounded in irrefutable facts. She knew that her best weapon was the truth, and she was prepared to use it. In the weeks leading up to the interview, Jasmine had pored over countless documents, consulted with constitutional experts, and meticulously reviewed the actions and decisions that had marked Trump's presidency. She had identified key moments, key decisions, and key contradictions that she could use to hold him accountable. There was no room for error. Each question had been carefully crafted to build toward an inevitable conclusion, one that Trump's defenders would find impossible to dismiss or deflect. Jasmine knew that the key to taking control of the interview was not in shouting over Trump, but in maintaining her composure and letting her preparation do the work for her. As the green room doors opened, the difference in how the two participants were preparing was stark. Trump, ever the showman, was in his element. He greeted the makeup artists, chatted with the camera operators, and checked his phone for the latest updates. It was business as usual for him. He treated the green room like a campaign rally, with his staff around him offering their approval and making sure everything was in place. There was a sense of confidence that radiated from him, as if he believed that no matter what happened, he could easily navigate his way through any tough questions with his usual blend of charm, aggression, and deflection. Trump's advisors, who had been with him through countless media appearances, were confident that this interview would be no different from any other. They had dealt with difficult interviews in the past and had always managed to spin the narrative in their favor. To them, this was just another opportunity for Trump to prove that he could outshine any opponent, even one who was a political newcomer. In contrast, Jasmine sat in the adjacent green room, calm and composed, with her briefcase and 3 manila envelopes in front of her. She didn't engage in small talk, didn't check her phone, and didn't rely on last-minute strategy sessions. She had already done all the preparation she needed. The documents were arranged in a specific order, not just for dramatic effect, but for logical progression. Each envelope contained evidence that would expose the contradictions in Trump's narrative. Jasmine knew exactly when to reveal each piece of information, building the pressure slowly, methodically, so that Trump would have nowhere to hide. It wasn't about theatrics. It was about forcing him to confront the truth. The makeup artist, who worked on both participants later, commented on the striking contrast between their demeanor. Trump was lively, cracking jokes, engaging with the crew, and displaying his usual energy. He was the center of attention, as always. Jasmine, on the other hand, was quietly focused, reviewing her notes, preparing herself for the interview ahead. Her posture was relaxed, but there was an underlying tension in the air, an anticipation that only comes before a major confrontation. She wasn't going to be intimidated by the spectacle or the loud personalities around her. For Jasmine, this wasn't a performance, it was a chance to make a real difference. She understood the weight of this moment and knew that how she handled herself would define not only her career but the kind of political discourse she wanted to contribute to. As the interview began and the cameras started rolling, the tension in the studio was palpable. The stage was set for a clash of political styles. Trump's brash, high-energy persona against Jasmine's calm, measured approach. The visual contrast was striking. Trump, with his expansive posture and charismatic presence, took up more space than necessary, physically and metaphorically. He was the embodiment of power, wealth, and privilege, using his sheer force of will to dominate the space around him. Jasmine, in contrast, sat with a quiet confidence, her gaze steady and unwavering, fully aware that she had the facts on her side. As the conversation unfolded, it became clear that the true test wouldn't be who could shout the loudest or command the most attention, but who could present the most compelling case for accountability and truth. From the very beginning of the interview, it was evident that Jasmine wasn't going to be intimidated by Trump's usual tactics. While Trump tried to dominate the conversation with his familiar talking points and aggressive deflections, Jasmine stayed calm, refusing to be drawn into his attempts to control the narrative. She was playing a different game altogether, one where facts and preparation would determine the moment Trump and Jasmine faced each other across the polished mahogany table. The atmosphere in the CNN studio seemed to hum with electric tension. The cameras captured the setup perfectly. Two individuals, representing two vastly different visions of America, sitting in a carefully crafted scene where every detail, every element, was designed to amplify the stakes of what was about to unfold. Jake Tapper, the neutral moderator, sat between them, a calm presence amid the brewing storm, while Trump and Jasmine were positioned across from one another, each with their own carefully calculated posture. Trump was in his usual element, looking every bit the seasoned political figure that he was, his chest puffed out and his hands gesturing expansively as he prepared to speak. Jasmine, in stark contrast, sat perfectly still, her hands resting calmly on the table, exuding a quiet strength that belied the immense pressure she was under. She was prepared for this moment, and every movement, every glance was a calculated step toward making the most of it. For the first few minutes, the conversation followed a pattern that many had seen in Trump's past interviews. He took control of the discussion immediately, launching into a defense of his economic policies, deflecting questions, and attacking the current administration. It was classic Trump, overwhelming the conversation with forceful assertions, cutting off his opponent's ability to ask difficult questions and making sure that he dominated the conversation. His team of advisors watching from the front row nodded in approval, fully expecting this to be just another victory for their boss. They knew that Trump had perfected this strategy over years of hostile media encounters, and they were confident that this interview would be no different. After all, they believed they were facing a political novice, someone who wouldn't be able to handle the barrage of talking points and rhetorical flourishes that Trump had mastered. But as Trump launched into his usual talking points, Jasmine remained calm, unfazed by his attempts to control the narrative. She allowed him to speak, knowing that her moment would come. It wasn't about interrupting him or trying to match his energy. It was about letting him dig his own hole, letting him ramble through his talking points until he opened the door for her to strike. And strike she did. When the first question came, it wasn't the kind of question that Trump was accustomed to answering. It wasn't an attack on his character or a question about his personal life. It wasn't a gotcha question designed to provoke an emotional response. No, this question was different. Jasmine asked a simple, straightforward question about his presidency. Mr. Trump, experience without accountability isn't leadership, it's impunity. It was a calm, factual statement, but one that was loaded with the kind of moral clarity that Trump couldn't easily dismiss. His initial reaction was one of disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend that someone would dare to challenge him so directly. He had spent years in the media spotlight, brushing aside every attack and deflection with ease, but this time was different. This time the stakes were higher. This time the question was grounded in a principle that Trump could not easily deny. The silence that followed Jasmine's statement was pregnant with meaning. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was undeniable. Trump had been forced to confront the very thing he had spent years avoiding. The idea that his time in office, for all its bluster and bravado, had lacked accountability. Jasmine's words cut through the noise and forced Trump to acknowledge a fundamental truth that he had tried to bury under layers of self-promotion and deflection. For the first time in the interview, Trump was on the defensive. He knew that he couldn't simply brush off the question with a quick soundbite or a dismissive comment. He had been put in a position where he was forced to reckon with the very thing that he had tried to avoid throughout his presidency: the question of accountability. As Trump stammered through his response, trying to deflect the question by pointing to his supposed accomplishments, it became clear that Jasmine's approach was working. She didn't need to interrupt him or raise her voice. She didn't need to engage in a shouting match or try to overpower him with rhetoric. Instead, she patiently waited for him to finish, allowing his response to hang in the air for a moment. She knew that the best way to expose his lack of accountability was not by attacking him directly, but by forcing him to explain his actions in the face of hard, undeniable truths. The contrast in their approaches was striking. Trump, with his usual bombast and confidence, was relying on his decades of experience in the media to dominate the conversation. He thought that by speaking louder, by pushing harder, he could control the narrative and avoid the uncomfortable questions. Jasmine, on the other hand, was playing a different game. She wasn't trying to match his energy or meet his aggression with more aggression. She was using her preparation, her knowledge, and her calm demeanor to let the truth speak for itself. Every question she asked, every statement she made was rooted in undeniable facts and solid research. She wasn't relying on her personality or her ability to dominate the conversation. She was relying on something far more powerful: the truth. As the interview continued, it became clear that Jasmine's preparation had put her in a position of power. While Trump relied on his usual tactics, interrupting, deflecting, and attacking, Jasmine remained calm, measured, and unflappable. She knew that the real victory wouldn't come from shouting louder or making grandiose statements. It would come from exposing the contradictions in Trump's narrative and forcing him to confront the truth. And as the interview wore on, it became evident that Jasmine was succeeding in her mission. The more Trump tried to deflect, the more Jasmine pushed him to face the facts. She wasn't allowing him to control the narrative, and as the seconds ticked by, it became clear that Trump was losing his grip on the conversation. The dynamic in the room was shifting, and the power was slowly but surely slipping. The pressure in the studio was mounting as the interview continued. With each passing minute, the contrast between Trump's usual media performance and Jasmine's composed, methodical questioning became even more apparent. His demeanor, once full of bravado, began to show cracks. The audience at home, along with those watching in the studio, could sense that something unprecedented was unfolding before them. The once seemingly invincible former president, who had so often dominated political discourse with his sheer force of personality and overwhelming confidence, was now visibly struggling. His attempts to control the conversation were being systematically undermined by Jasmine's unflappable composure and her commitment to exposing the truth. In the moments that followed, Trump's usual deflection tactics became increasingly desperate. As Jasmine continued to present facts and ask pointed questions, his responses grew more frantic and unhinged. He began to interrupt more aggressively, raising his voice in an attempt to overpower her calm, steady tone. But it was clear to anyone watching that the tables had turned. Jasmine was no longer just asking questions. She was now the one in control. With every fact she presented, with every piece of evidence she laid out, she slowly but surely dismantled the carefully constructed narrative that Trump had spent years building. His defenses, once so carefully crafted, were now crumbling under the weight of undeniable truth. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so dramatically that it was impossible to ignore. Jasmine, who had come into this interview as an underdog and an inexperienced congresswoman up against a former president, was now the one in charge. She wasn't relying on theatrics or empty rhetoric. She was relying on facts, on years of preparation, and on the quiet authority that came from knowing that she was speaking truth to power. Trump, on the other hand, was floundering. His usual strategy of dominating the conversation with volume and aggression was no longer working. Every time he attempted to steer the conversation back to safer ground, Jasmine expertly countered him with more facts, more evidence, and more precise questions. He couldn't keep up. In a pivotal moment, Trump tried to redirect the conversation to his economic accomplishments, hoping to reassert control by touting his supposed successes in office. But Jasmine wasn't having it. She had prepared for this. She knew that Trump would try to deflect, try to pivot to his favorite talking points to avoid accountability. She had anticipated this move and was ready to call him out on it. With a steady hand, she placed the first document in front of her on the table, deliberately ensuring that it was visible to both Trump and the cameras. She spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had been in this situation before, but with a sharp edge that made her words cut through the air. "Mr. Trump, these are the numbers from your administration," she said, her voice measured but unwavering. "According to official records, your economic policies did not achieve the success you claim. These are the facts, and they cannot be disputed." Trump's reaction was immediate. His face flushed with anger as he attempted to dismiss the evidence with a wave of his hand. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She continued, unflinching, to lay out the facts before him. "This," she said, "is the truth, and it's not about political theater or spin. It's about accountability. It's about understanding what your presidency actually did, not what you wanted people to believe it did." For a moment, the room fell silent. The air seemed to crackle with tension as Trump, for the first time, was faced with the cold reality of his own record. His advisors, who had once been so confident in their ability to control the narrative, were now visibly uncomfortable. They shifted in their seats, exchanging nervous glances as they realized that this interview was slipping away from them. The man who had prided himself on being able to manipulate any situation, any conversation, was now at a loss for words. Jasmine's calm, methodical approach had forced him into a corner. His usual deflection tactics, the ones he had used so successfully throughout his career, were no longer working. The audience at home, including millions of viewers who had tuned in expecting another round of Trump's media theatrics, were now watching something entirely different. They were watching a man who had built an empire on manipulation, on deflection, and on overwhelming his opponents, be forced to reckon with the truth. The stark contrast between the two participants was undeniable. While Trump's advisors frantically checked their phones for damage control strategies, trying to come up with a way to salvage the situation, Jasmine remained calm and poised. Her hands were steady, her voice unwavering, as she continued to present the facts. She wasn't distracted by Trump's outbursts or his desperate attempts to shift the conversation. She knew what she was doing, and she was executing her plan with military precision. As the interview wore on, the contrast between their approaches became even more pronounced. Trump, once the master of controlling the narrative, was now struggling to keep up with Jasmine's relentless focus and precision. His usual strategy of dominating the conversation with rapid-fire talking points and deflections was no longer enough to hold sway. Jasmine's preparation, her knowledge, and her calm demeanor had exposed his weaknesses, and there was no way for him to escape the truth that was unfolding before millions of viewers. Jasmine's victory wasn't just in the questions she asked, or the facts she presented. It was in the way she had exposed the underlying flaws in Trump's approach to leadership. Throughout his presidency, Trump had prided himself on his ability to manipulate the system, to operate above the law, and to avoid accountability at every turn. But in this interview, Jasmine had shown the world that accountability could not be avoided forever. No matter how much power, wealth, or influence one had, the truth would always catch up with them in the end. The silence in the room was deafening as Jasmine continued to speak. With each word she uttered, she chipped away at the walls of arrogance and privilege that Trump had carefully constructed around himself. The once unshakable confidence that had defined his public persona was now gone, replaced by visible signs of discomfort and anxiety. Trump's usual bravado had faltered, and Jasmine's calm composure had shown that preparation, truth, and integrity could defeat the forces of wealth, power, and privilege. As the interview reached its climax, the power dynamic was entirely reversed. Jasmine had gone from being the underdog, an unknown freshman congresswoman, to the dominant force in the room. She had successfully dismantled Trump's carefully curated image, and the world was watching as she did it. This wasn't just a political interview. As the interview entered its final moments, the atmosphere in the CNN studio had shifted completely. What began as a carefully orchestrated political appearance had turned into a battle of wills, a high-stakes confrontation between a former president, who had long relied on his ability to dominate the media, and a congresswoman who was determined to hold him accountable. Jasmine Crockett, through her unwavering composure and meticulous preparation, had turned the tide in this battle, forcing Trump into a defensive position where his usual tactics of deflection and disruption no longer had the power they once did. The cameras, which had once captured Trump's confident and aggressive posturing, now documented a man who was visibly struggling to maintain control over the situation. His posture had shifted from expansive and commanding to defensive and uncertain. His face, which had once been full of bravado, was now flushed with anger, his eyes darting nervously to his advisors, seeking their guidance as the interview unraveled in ways he had not anticipated. For the first time in his media career, Trump was on the back foot, unable to command the conversation or manipulate the narrative as he had done so many times before. The shift was subtle at first, but over time, it became unmistakable. Jasmine, with her calm and unrelenting approach, had methodically deconstructed every deflection, every attack, and every narrative that Trump had tried to construct in his favor. Each question she posed was designed not just to challenge him, but to expose the contradictions at the heart of his presidency. She didn't need to raise her voice, to interrupt, or to rely on theatrics to make her point. She simply let the facts speak for themselves. And as she did, the truth became undeniable. Every attempt by Trump to redirect the conversation, every deflection he made to avoid accountability only served to further highlight his inability to address the core issues she had raised. His answers became more erratic, his body language more defensive. He was no longer the dominant figure in the room, and the more he tried to reassert control, the more apparent it became that he was losing this battle. At this point in the interview, the true scale of Jasmine's victory became clear. Trump had been forced to confront the contradictions and failures of his presidency in a way that he had never been required to do before. His usual political gamesmanship had failed him. The carefully crafted image of the brash, confident leader who could dominate any conversation had crumbled under the weight of Jasmine's preparation and factual evidence. As she continued to ask questions and present documented evidence, the tension in the studio grew. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, as if everyone present, both in the studio and watching at home, understood that something significant was happening. Jasmine wasn't just challenging Trump's actions or policies. She was challenging the very notion of impunity that had allowed him to escape accountability for so long. In the past, he had always been able to rely on his wealth, his power, and his media presence to shield him from consequences. But in this moment, none of those factors mattered. The only thing that mattered was the truth. As Jasmine turned the conversation to the specific details of Trump's actions surrounding the January 6th Capitol insurrection, the atmosphere in the studio became even more charged. Trump, who had spent much of the interview trying to avoid discussing his role in the events of that day, was now cornered. He had been caught in the act of attempting to subvert the democratic process, and Jasmine wasn't going to let him escape it. She opened the second envelope with deliberate precision, her movements slow and measured as if to underline the importance of what she was about to reveal. The document she presented was clear and damning. It was an official communication, one that showed that Trump had been aware of the potential for violence during the January 6th rally, yet had continued to encourage his supporters to gather at the Capitol. Jasmine's voice, steady and unwavering, cut through the tension in the room as she presented the document to the cameras. "These internal communications," she began, her eyes fixed on Trump, "show that your staff was aware of the potential for violence at the rally, and yet you proceeded with it anyway. This was not just a failure of leadership. It was an intentional disregard for the safety and well-being of the American people." Trump's reaction was immediate. His face, once flushed with anger, now registered a shift to one of palpable concern. His eyes flicked to his advisors, who were frantically checking their phones and tablets for any response or strategy to handle the fallout. The message was clear. Trump was losing control. He had spent years avoiding consequences for his actions, but now, in this moment, the consequences were staring him in the face and he had no answer. The legal and political ramifications of his involvement in the January 6th events were undeniable, and there was nowhere for him to hide. His usual defense mechanisms, his ability to shift the blame, to deflect responsibility, had failed him. The documented evidence that Jasmine had presented was irrefutable, and it had put him in a position where he could no longer evade accountability. Jasmine, however, was not finished. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without fully driving home the point that Trump's actions had endangered the very fabric of American democracy. As the interview continued, she dug deeper, forcing him to confront not just the events of January 6th but the broader implications of his presidency. She opened the third envelope with the same calculated precision, her eyes never leaving Trump's face. The documents inside were even more devastating than the previous ones. They revealed a clear pattern of behavior that showed Trump's willingness to undermine the democratic process in order to maintain power. The room fell silent as Jasmine laid out the final piece of evidence: an internal communication from Trump's chief of staff. As the interview drew toward its climax, the tension in the studio had become palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Donald Trump, once the towering figure of the American political scene, now seemed small and frail in comparison to the unshakable composure of Jasmine Crockett. She had not only held her own but had systematically dismantled the carefully constructed defenses of the former president. What had started as a battle of words, as a seemingly routine media appearance, had turned into a confrontation that would be remembered for years to come. Trump, who had so often been able to dominate any conversation, was now visibly uncomfortable. His usual deflections, his attempts to dominate with forceful rhetoric and quick retorts, had failed him. Jasmine, the Texas congresswoman, had outmaneuvered him at every turn, presenting facts, asking sharp, incisive questions, and forcing him into positions where he could no longer avoid accountability. The power dynamic in the room had shifted dramatically. The once confident Trump, known for his ability to manipulate media narratives and control public perception, was now reduced to a defensive figure, his voice faltering as he attempted to explain away the mounting evidence of his failings and misdeeds. His body language, once expansive and domineering, had shrunk into something smaller, more defensive. He fidgeted, his hands shook slightly, and his gaze darted nervously to his advisors, who were now watching him with increasing concern. His attempts to push the conversation toward familiar talking points, to redirect the focus to his so-called achievements, had become increasingly hollow. The room could feel it. The once dominant figure in the interview was no longer in control. Jasmine, on the other hand, sat poised and composed, her every word carefully measured, each question calculated to expose the truth. Her confidence was not born of theatrics or empty gestures, but from her preparation, her knowledge, and her unwavering commitment to holding the powerful accountable. She had known from the very beginning that this interview would not be about winning a soundbite or gaining political points. It was about something far more significant. It was about confronting a man who had held the highest office in the land, who had tested the very foundations of American democracy, and forcing him to reckon with the consequences of his actions. Jasmine's approach was methodical, precise, and, most importantly, grounded in undeniable facts. She was not here to match Trump's bravado or to engage in a shouting match. She was here to present the truth, and the truth was something that Trump could no longer escape. The interview had already shattered expectations. The world had tuned in expecting another performance from Trump, another round of his signature media antics, his grandiose statements, his dismissals of critics, his attempts to control the narrative through sheer force of will. But what they were witnessing was something entirely different. They were witnessing a reckoning. Jasmine's questions, which had seemed simple at first, were in fact a series of meticulously constructed traps. With each document she presented, with each question she asked, the walls of Trump's defense crumbled further. His strategy of deflection had failed him. His usual tactics of dominating the conversation, of speaking over his opponents, had only served to expose the cracks in his narrative. Trump had always prided himself on his ability to speak over others, to overwhelm his opponents with his presence and his words. It was a tactic that had served him well throughout his career, whether in business, television, or politics. But Jasmine had stripped that tactic of its power. She had refused to be intimidated by his words, his gestures, or his attempts to dominate the conversation. Instead, she had stood firm, unwavering, forcing him to confront the truth. And in doing so, she had taken control of the conversation, shifting the power dynamic in a way that was unprecedented in Trump's media career. The contrast between the two could not have been more stark. Trump, once the undisputed master of the political media landscape, now seemed like a man out of his depth. His voice, which had once been filled with confidence, now carried an edge of desperation. His hands, which had once gestured expansively, now trembled slightly, betraying the anxiety he was trying to hide. His eyes, which had once glinted with the self-assurance of a man used to getting what he wanted, now darted nervously from one advisor to another, seeking help, seeking an escape. He had spent his entire career deflecting responsibility, avoiding consequences, and manipulating the narrative to his advantage. But in this interview, the narrative had slipped from his grasp. Jasmine's calm authority had exposed him for what he truly was, a man who had spent years evading accountability, relying on his wealth, his power, and his ability to manipulate the system to escape the consequences of his actions. She had turned his greatest strength, his ability to control the media, into his greatest weakness. She had shown the world that it was possible to hold him accountable, that it was possible to challenge him without resorting to emotional outbursts or theatrics. Her approach was grounded in preparation, in facts, and in an unwavering commitment to the truth. And in the end, it had proven far more powerful than Trump's usual tactics of deflection and aggression. As the interview neared its conclusion, the tension in the room was palpable. Jasmine, having exposed the flaws in Trump's narrative and forced him to confront the truth, was now taking control of the conversation entirely. Trump's advisors, who had once been so confident in their ability to manage the situation, were now visibly uncomfortable. They had seen their client, the former president, reduced to a man who could no longer control the narrative. They had witnessed the collapse of the carefully constructed image that Trump had spent years building, and they knew that there was nothing they could do to salvage it. The damage had been done. For Jasmine, this was not just a personal victory. It was a victory for accountability, for the principle that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law. It was a victory for the idea that truth, preparation, and principle could still triumph over wealth, privilege, and deflection. In a world where political power was often built on manipulation and spin, Jasmine had shown that it was possible to cut through the noise and get to the heart of the matter. And in doing so, she had forced Trump to face the consequences of his actions in a way that no one else had been able to do before. As the cameras captured every moment of the final exchange, it was clear that this interview would be remembered as one of the most significant political moments of the decade. The weight of the interview's final moments hung in the air, thick and undeniable, as Donald Trump sat there, visibly diminished. For the first time in his career, the force of his personality, the overwhelming presence that had carried him through decades of media dominance, could not shield him from the relentless precision of Jasmine Crockett's questions. She had taken what was meant to be a routine media appearance, something Trump had undoubtedly expected to be just another moment of media performance, and turned it into a masterclass in political accountability. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every shift in body language, every change in Trump's demeanor, every subtle movement that betrayed his growing discomfort. Trump's usual swagger, the arrogance that had defined him throughout his life and career, had all but disappeared. His posture had shrunk, his body language had become more defensive, and his voice, which once carried the force of a man accustomed to being the loudest in the room, now faltered with uncertainty. The walls he had built around himself, walls of wealth, power, and the privilege of his celebrity, had crumbled under the weight of Jasmine's preparation, her facts, and her unwavering commitment to holding him accountable. For Trump, a man who had spent years deflecting blame, evading responsibility, and leveraging his media dominance to sidestep consequences, this was a moment unlike any other. He could no longer rely on his usual tactics. The deflections, the interruptions, the emotional outbursts, all of them had failed him. His advisors, who had once been so confident in their ability to manage the narrative, were now visibly nervous. They had watched as their client, the man who had prided himself on his media savvy, was reduced to a figure who could no longer dominate the conversation. The cameras had caught it all: the desperate glances to his aides, the flustered movements, the inability to regain control of the interview. Jasmine, by contrast, had remained calm throughout. She wasn't interested in performing for the cameras or engaging in a battle of egos. She had done the hard work: weeks of preparation, hours of studying, consulting experts, and reviewing every document, every piece of evidence that could hold Trump accountable. And in that moment, it became clear that her preparation was her greatest weapon. She wasn't relying on her personality or her ability to dominate the conversation. She had something far more powerful at her disposal: the truth. Jasmine's steady, unflappable demeanor was in stark contrast to Trump's increasingly erratic behavior. She had not been drawn into his provocations, nor had she allowed him to control the narrative. Every question she asked was a calculated step toward her goal: exposing the truth, revealing the flaws in his presidency, and forcing him to confront the consequences of his actions. And with each question, she tightened the noose around Trump's narrative. With each piece of evidence, she solidified her position, proving that truth could not be manipulated, deflected, or avoided forever. As Trump continued to falter, his defenses weakened with each passing second, and the tension in the studio reached a boiling point. The contrast between the two could not have been more striking. Trump, the man who had once thrived in the spotlight, who had used his media dominance to manipulate public opinion, was now reduced to a mere shell of that persona. His every attempt to regain control of the interview felt hollow, desperate, and increasingly futile. He had spent years using his position of power to shield himself from scrutiny, but Jasmine had shown the world that no one, no matter how powerful, no matter how wealthy, was above accountability. She had taken a man who had spent his entire career escaping responsibility and forced him into a position where he could no longer hide from the truth. In the final moments of the interview, as Trump continued to flounder, trying to regain his footing, Jasmine's composure never wavered. She knew that the battle for the narrative had already been won. The facts were on her side. The evidence she had presented was irrefutable. And now, it was time to finish what she had started. Her final question was not just the conclusion of the interview. It was the closing argument in a case that had been months in the making. "Mr. Trump," Jasmine began, her voice steady and calm, "you have spent your entire career trying to avoid accountability. You have used your wealth, your power, and your celebrity to shield yourself from the consequences of your actions. But today, you are forced to confront the truth. The facts, the documents, the evidence, all of it points to one undeniable conclusion: you failed to lead this country. And you failed to protect the very democracy you swore to defend." The silence that followed her statement was deafening. For a moment, Trump sat there, visibly stunned. His mouth moved as if to speak, but no words came out. The weight of Jasmine's words had landed squarely on his shoulders, and for the first time in this interview he had no response. His advisors, who had been watching intently from the front row, exchanged nervous glances. It was clear that the narrative they had worked so hard to craft, the story they had tried to tell, was slipping away from them. The cameras, capturing every moment, focused on Trump's face, which now registered a mix of disbelief and frustration. His hands trembled slightly and he wiped his forehead nervously, a subtle sign of the growing anxiety that he could no longer hide. He had been reduced to a figure struggling to hold on to the image of invincibility he had carefully built over the years. But it was too late. Jasmine had exposed the truth in a way that left no room for deflection, no space for escape. The power dynamics in the studio had shifted irreparably. As the interview finally came to a close, Trump stood up. As the interview concluded and the cameras stopped rolling, the reality of what had just transpired began to reverberate throughout the studio. For Donald Trump, the familiar sense of dominance he had once wielded in the media was gone, replaced by a lingering sense of defeat. He had arrived in that studio expecting a political performance, expecting to do what he had always done, assert his control over the conversation, deflect uncomfortable questions, and remind the public of his supposed accomplishments. Instead, he had been caught off guard by the relentless precision and thoroughness of Jasmine Crockett's questioning. Every deflection, every evasive move had been countered with facts, with evidence, with a calm, unwavering determination to expose the truth. And in doing so, Jasmine had not only forced Trump to confront his actions, but she had also shifted the narrative in ways that no one, least of all Trump, could have predicted. The moment the interview ended, Trump's advisors, who had been watching from the front row, sprang into action. They quickly gathered their things, whispering among themselves as they tried to come up with a way to salvage the situation. They were fully aware that the interview had not gone as planned. Trump's deflections had been ineffective. His usual media tactics had fallen flat, and the narrative they had hoped to control was now firmly in Jasmine's hands. Their job, as they saw it, was to minimize the damage, to spin the narrative back in Trump's favor. But the damage had already been done. In the hours that followed, the world would see the interview in a completely different light. The once proud and dominant figure of Donald Trump, who had come into the interview full of swagger, had been exposed as a man who could no longer manipulate the media, or evade the consequences of his actions. For Jasmine, however, the victory was not just about winning the interview or scoring political points. It was about something far more significant: holding the powerful accountable, no matter their position or influence. It was about proving that preparation, facts, and an unwavering commitment to the truth could still triumph over bluster, privilege, and deflection. As the footage of the interview began to spread across social media and news outlets, the response was immediate. Political analysts, legal experts, and ordinary Americans began to weigh in on what they had just witnessed. For many, it was a turning point in the way politics would be discussed and conducted. The interview had shown the world that even the most powerful figures in American politics were not above scrutiny, not above accountability. Jasmine had set a new standard for political discourse, one in which truth and integrity were more powerful than media manipulation or political gamesmanship. The media, both traditional and digital, was abuzz with coverage of the interview. Pundits and commentators who had once assumed that Trump's media dominance would always shield him from real accountability were now forced to confront the reality that he had been outplayed. Jasmine's calm, composed demeanor had become the focal point of every discussion. She had outclassed Trump not by raising her voice or engaging in a war of words, but by doing something far more powerful: presenting the truth, unflinchingly, and with purpose. Her preparation, her knowledge, and her ability to remain calm under pressure had proven to be her greatest strengths. As the fallout from the interview continued to unfold, the political world was forced to reckon with the implications of what had just happened. Trump, who had spent years evading accountability and using his wealth and power to shield himself from the consequences of his actions, was now facing a reckoning like no other. The evidence Jasmine had presented, the documents, the testimonies, the facts could not be ignored or dismissed. The truth had been laid bare for all to see, and there was no escaping it. For the first time, Trump had been forced to confront the full extent of his presidency, not through the lens of media spin or political theater, but through the cold, hard reality of documented facts. For Jasmine, the aftermath of the interview was a whirlwind. Her phone rang nonstop with messages of support and admiration from colleagues, constituents, and even people who had previously disagreed with her on various political issues. The interview had not just catapulted her into the national spotlight. It had also made her a symbol of what politics could be when it was grounded in integrity and truth. She had faced down one of the most powerful figures in American politics, and she had emerged victorious, not because of her ability to shout the loudest or make the most dramatic statements, but because she had done the work. She had prepared, she had researched, and most importantly, she had stayed true to her principles. In the days following the interview, the political landscape began to shift. More and more Americans, particularly young people, began to engage with the idea that politics could be more than just about personalities and power struggles. They saw in Jasmine's performance a model for how politics could be done differently. It wasn't about flashy rhetoric or clever sound bites. It was about asking tough questions, holding people accountable, and prioritizing the truth over political expediency. Jasmine's victory had sparked a national conversation about what political leadership should look like, and how public service could be grounded in integrity, accountability, and service to the people. The response from Trump's camp was predictable, but it did little to change the narrative. They quickly issued a series of statements attempting to discredit the evidence Jasmine had presented, calling the documents fake news and attacking her character. But the damage was done. The footage of the interview, Trump's deflection, his failure to answer the tough questions, and his increasingly desperate attempts to regain control had already been seen by millions. It was too late to spin the